Jeanne-Françoise Julie Adélaïde Bernard, to give Madame Récamier her full name, was born at Lyon on the 3rd of December, 1777, and would be known throughout her life as Juliette. Her father, Jean Bernard, worked as a notary for a few years, but in 1786 he encountered some difficulties in his post and was threatened with imprisonment. As his wife, Madame Bernard, possessed unusual business skills, he sent her to Paris to settle the matter. Alexandre de Calonne, Controller General of Finances, who couldn't resist the charms of a pretty woman such as Madame Bernard, listened to her pleas and arranged for her husband to be appointed collector of customs in Paris. As a result of her parents' move to Paris, 9-year-old Juliette was left in the care of her mother's sister, who, a few months later, placed her in a convent in Lyon. There she spent 2 happy years, until one day when, Juliette said, I found myself in a carriage by the side of my aunt and we started for Paris. I left with regret that tranquil and innocent period of my life to enter upon one of turmoil. Madame Bernard, who placed great importance on the power of beauty, made her daughter spend long hours in front of her dressing table and reminded her that it was a woman's duty to think of her personal charms. But Juliette's education wasn't neglected either. She learned Italian and English, studied music, and took singing lessons, and was very good at playing the harp and especially the piano, which would become her greatest passion and comfort throughout her life. Once, when Juliette and her parents went to Versailles to be present at one of the last grand dinners where Louis XVI and his wife dined in public, she was noticed by Marie Antoinette, who thought that Juliette seemed nearly the same age as her daughter. Promptly she was invited to the private apartments of the royal family, and to her surprise she was measured with Madame Royale. Juliette was found to be a little taller than the princess. As the Bernard family led a comfortable life and enjoyed giving supper parties, their house became a magnet for visitors from literary, political, and wealthy circles. One of their many guests was Jacques-Rose Récamier, a rich banker famous in Paris for his magnificent style of living. He knew Juliette's mother very well, and in February 1793 he asked for her daughter's hand in marriage. The proposal was accepted, and in the spring of that year 15-year-old Juliette became Madame Récamier. But, as the niece of Monsieur Récamier later said, the marriage between Juliette and the 42-year-old banker was indeed never more than an apparent one. Madame Récamier received her husband's name. There was nothing more between them. Monsieur Récamier never had any but paternal relations with his wife. This sounds astonishing, but it is not my business to explain the fact. However, to a certain extent this can be explained. The marriage took place during the revolutionary turmoil, when one by one all of the people with whom Récamier had been close in business were guillotined. To get accustomed to a similar fate, Récamier used to go daily to the Place de la Concorde to watch the guillotine claim lives. He lived in permanent fear of becoming one of its victims. By his own admission, he had feelings for Juliette's mother and was in fact her lover. Gossip said that Récamier was Juliette's father, and given the danger he was in, he wanted to settle his wealth upon his daughter. And to this end, Récamier and Madame Bernard found the solution in the marriage that was forced upon Juliette. Whether Récamier was indeed Juliette's biological father hasn't been established, and to this day it remains a mystery. Placed in this difficult and unusual situation, and unaware for the time being of the circumstances that had led to her marriage with Récamier, Juliette would be called upon to make serious decisions about her future. During the following years, when the fury of the Revolution disrupted many people's lives, the Bernard family led a relative safe existence, thanks to the protection of Bertrand Barrère, a member of the National Convention and one of the most feared revolutionaries, who was a close friend of Madame Bernard. As a result, Récamier escaped the revolutionary axe. Also, it is worth mentioning that Jean Bernard was probably the only collector of customs of Louis XVI who kept his head. Slowly, as the intensity of the revolution subsided, the entire society of the Directory lived again. People began to gather in the parks, went to the theatre, and attended subscription balls. On the 10th of December 1797, when Napoleon Bonaparte returned from his victorious Italian campaign, the Directory gave a party in his honor at the Palais du Luxembourg. Juliette and her mother were invited. As Talleyrand read an address of congratulation to the conqueror of Italy, Bonaparte was loudly applauded. But the animated audience gathered around the hero of the day made it impossible for Juliette to distinguish the features of the general. So, to get a better view of him, she slowly rose from her seat. As she did that, a long murmur of admiration was heard across the court of the palace. Looking around to see what might distract attention from himself, Bonaparte noticed a young woman, dressed in white, who was able to hold the people's gaze more than he did. Annoyed, he frowned at Juliette, who blushed and sat down at once. Describing Juliette, one of her contemporaries said, "She never wore diamonds. Pearls were the only ornaments suited to her exquisitely simple style of dress." A peculiarity of her beauty was that at first sight it was more attractive than dazzling. The more one looked at her, the more beautiful she seemed. Meanwhile, Récamier established Juliette and her mother at the Château de Clichy, not far from the capital, while he remained in Paris, travelling to Clichy for dinner every evening. "One day, and that marks an epoch in my life," Juliette said, "Monsieur Récamier arrived at Clichy with a lady whom he didn't introduce by name, and whom he left alone with me in the salon." This lady came about the sale of a house. I was thinking more of finding out, or rather guessing, who she was, when she said to me that she was truly delighted to make my acquaintance, that her father, Monsieur Necker. At these words I recognized Madame de Staël. I didn't hear the rest of her sentence. I had just been reading her Lettres sur Rousseau, in the perusal of which I was intensely interested. This meeting was the beginning of a long-lasting friendship between Juliette and Germaine de Staël, a woman of genius whose influence over Juliette's life would be profound. After buying the house from Jacques Necker, a former finance minister of Louis XVI, Récamier transformed it into the most elegant residence in Paris. Here, lavish parties were given to the ever-increasing group of friends of Monsieur Récamier and his beautiful wife, who became the perfect hostess. But it wasn't only beauty that Juliette possessed. She had exquisite tact and an amiable disposition, and was able to compliment people without flattery, drawing to herself the thoughts and confidences of others. And soon many of the politicians, generals, men of letters, ambassadors, and nobles who came to the salon of Madame Récamier became her admirers. Lucien Bonaparte, who sent Juliette love letters and signed himself Romeo, was in turmoil for about a year before he understood that he couldn't get from her what he wanted. He wrote to Juliette saying, "I am no longer governed by myself, but by suffering. In this position, friendship is nothing to me. Love is the only thing for which my heart longs. But you are as calm as I am agitated, and this calmness of yours is killing me." After Napoleon Bonaparte became First Consul of France, following the fall of the Directory, Lucien gave a party in his brother's honor. On this occasion, Juliette, who was among the guests, noticed a man standing by the fireplace in the salon. In the dim light, she took him for Joseph Bonaparte, whom she had frequently met at the salon of Madame de Staël, and greeted him. But shortly she realized that it was the First Consul who greeted her back. To express what impression she made on him, he sent Fouché, the Minister of Police, to say to her, "The First Consul thinks you charming." That evening, during dinner, Juliette took a seat on the same side of the table as Bonaparte, but not close to him. When dinner was over, he approached her and said, "Why didn't you sit next to me at dinner?" "I shouldn't have presumed to do so," she replied. "It was your place," said Bonaparte. In August 1802, Juliette's father, Monsieur Bernard, who was at the head of the post office, was suspected of being involved in a royalist conspiracy. On the day of his arrest, Juliette rushed to the Théâtre Français to see the sister of the First Consul, Madame Bacciochi, begging for her help to obtain a meeting with her brother. But as she wanted to see the end of the show, Madame Bacciochi told Juliette to wait a little while. General Bernadotte, who was in the box, noticed how distressed Juliette was, and offered to escort her home, promising that he would speak to Bonaparte about her father. Not without some difficulty, he obtained from the first consul the release of her father, and by doing so Bernadotte became one of Juliette's cavaliers and most attached friend. Both Mathieu de Montmorency and his cousin Adrien loved Juliette passionately, and in time the number of those whose hearts were inflamed by Juliette would only increase. But she yielded to none, and kept them all, or almost all, as friends. One of them said to her, "You are the only woman in the country who can persuade the lover into being contented with friendship." Many taxed her as a cold-hearted flirt, without understanding the causes of it. Sainte-Beuve, who knew Juliette very well, said of her, "She placed her ideal of romance where she found it in so small a degree, that is to say, in marriage. And more than once, in her best days, in the midst of a fête where she was the acknowledged queen, it came into her head, she said, to escape the homage and to go away and weep." Having initially admired Bonaparte, Madame de Staël quickly perceived his despotic tendencies and became his opponent. When her lover Benjamin Constant made a speech against the increasing tyranny, Bonaparte suspected that she was the mastermind behind it. In the autumn of 1803, when Madame de Staël was exiled to a distance of 40 leagues from Paris, Juliette declared, "The man who banished a woman, and such a woman, could, in my opinion, only be a pitiless despot." From then on, I was entirely against him, against his accession to the empire, against the establishment of unlimited power. After Napoleon became emperor, he began assembling his own court and thought he could use the charms of a beautiful woman like Madame Récamier. So he sent Fouché to induce her to join the imperial household by becoming Dame du Palais. "Since the day he first met you," he said to her, "the emperor has never forgotten you, and though he complains that you have ranged yourself among his enemies, he doesn't blame you, but your friends." Surprised by this offer, Juliette made known to Fouché her true sentiments towards Napoleon. Although she had been impressed by the brilliancy of his genius and the simplicity of his manners, the execution of the Duc d'Enghien, the exile of Madame de Staël, and the persecution of her friend General Moreau had checked her enthusiasm for the emperor and chilled her sympathy. Juliette's refusal made Fouché remark that insulting the emperor wasn't a good idea. One day, in the autumn of 1806, Récamier disclosed to his wife that his powerful banking house was in trouble. He was hopeful, though, that this difficult situation would be temporary, as he had already applied for a loan from the Bank of France and was waiting for an answer. But the loan was refused, and Juliette had no doubt that the reason behind it was the emperor's personal resentment towards her. The house was put up for sale. Juliette sold all her jewels and accepted her new situation with dignity. One of the things which affected her most was the obligation caused by her husband's bankruptcy to renounce the keeping up of a school for girls that she had founded in the parish of Saint-Sulpice. When Germaine heard about Juliette's difficulties, she wrote to her saying, "You have lost all that pertains to the ease and luxury of life. But if such a thing could be possible, you will be more loved and honoured than ever. Beauty has no equal in Europe. Your reputation is without a stain, and those admirable characteristics of yours, generosity and kind-heartedness, will, in spite of yourself, become known through these misfortunes as they never would have been without them." She was right. None of Juliette's friends deserted her. Bernadotte wrote to her on the eve of the Battle of Auerstedt to say, "If you still think of me, remember that you are my chief thought, and that nothing can equal the tender and loving affection I have for you." After seeing her in Paris, Junot, who called Juliette his dear sister, rejoined Napoleon in Prussia and mentioned to him how all of France extended its sympathy to Juliette. Sarcastically, the Emperor remarked, "They wouldn't have shown so much respect to the widow of a Marshal of France killed on the field of battle." After the death of her mother, which was hastened by Récamier's ruin, Juliette felt lost, as she had never been separated from Madame Bernard since childhood. At this difficult moment in her life, Juliette, who was almost 30, received an invitation from Madame de Staël to join her in Switzerland. And in the summer of 1807, Juliette was reunited with her friend at Coppet, where Madame de Staël had a chateau on the beautiful shores of Lake Geneva. Among the guests present at the Château de Coppet, there was a 28-year-old Prussian prince who had been taken prisoner at the Battle of Prenzlau. Prince Augustus of Prussia, nephew of Frederick the Great, was treated lightly by Napoleon and was in a state of conditional freedom at Geneva. The prince fell passionately in love with Juliette, and, with the blessing of Madame de Staël, who had shared some details about Juliette's union with Récamier, convinced her to break off her marriage and marry him. As she was deeply touched by his affection, before the prince left Coppet in October to return to Prussia, Juliette promised she would do anything to make this union possible. Vows were exchanged between them. Longing for freedom, she wrote to her husband and requested the dissolution of their marriage. Although he didn't refuse, Récamier made an appeal to her generous heart and recalled the care and affection he had shown to her since childhood. He added that if she persisted with this project, the divorce should take place somewhere outside France. Once more, Juliette was asked to sacrifice herself to the conventionalities of society. After reading his letter, the idea of abandoning Récamier, now stripped of fortune and in old age, seemed impossible to her, and unable to break the bonds that caused her unhappiness, she resigned herself to her fate. When Prince Augustus received the news, he was heartbroken. He kept sending her letters and never gave up the hope of finding happiness with Juliette as his wife. As she blamed herself for being unable to keep the promise she had made to the prince, Juliette thought of ending her life. Fortunately, she found enough strength in her to get over this critical moment in her life. After a while, she sent the prince her portrait and a ring with the inscription, "I shall see him again." Although Prince Augustus had other affairs, he never got married, and many years later, 3 months before he died, he wrote to Juliette saying, "The ring that you gave me I will carry to the grave." For a number of years, Madame de Staël had been working on a book about Germany, and in 1810 she decided to publish it in Paris. So in the summer of that year, she travelled to France within her prescribed limits in order to supervise the printing of de l'Allemagne, and after the censors of the press removed whatever opinions they thought might displease Napoleon, 10,000 copies were printed for the first edition. But the Emperor opposed its publication, and the whole edition was confiscated and destroyed, while Madame de Staël was ordered to leave France in 3 days forever. Broken in spirit, she returned to Coppet, and after a while she decided to go to Sweden to take refuge with her husband's relatives. Juliette, who wanted to say goodbye to her dear friend, started for Coppet on the 23rd of August 1811. Mathieu de Montmorency had gone there before her. But when the Emperor heard of this, he sent orders for both Mathieu and Juliette to be exiled. Forbidden to come within 40 leagues of Paris, Juliette would spend the following 3 years wandering from place to place. In Lyon, she met the philosopher Pierre-Simon Ballanche, whose devotion and affection for her helped Juliette overcome many difficult moments. In the history of human friendships, François Guizot said, "I can scarcely think of a more beautiful one, or one that honors both people more, than that of Madame Récamier and Monsieur Ballanche." In the spring of 1813, when Juliette went to Rome, she won the admiration of the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova, who surrendered to her charms and executed 2 busts of her. Later she was in Naples, spending time with her old friends Joachim and Caroline Murat, when she learned that Paris had been invaded by the Allies and Napoleon had abdicated. On the 1st of June 1814, Juliette arrived in Paris and found there her intimate friends, Mathieu, Germaine, and Benjamin. And, as she was again very much in vogue, an elite gathered from the society of Europe, such as the Duke of Wellington, David the painter, Bernadotte, Metternich, Canova, Humboldt, and many others, went to her salon. Both Metternich and the Duke of Wellington became Juliette's ardent adorers, who courted her, but in vain. When speaking about her charm, the Comtesse de Boigny wrote to Juliette, saying, "I have told you this 100 times. It is your kindness which makes you so fascinating. I am persuaded that if it were possible to define the influence that you exercise, this same kindness would have more power than all the other advantages, more brilliant, no doubt, but to which it adds more force. And so, madame, it is because you are kind that you have turned so many heads and made so many unfortunate men desperate. They have no idea of this, but it is, nevertheless, true." When in March 1815 the news of Napoleon's return from Elba dispersed the returned émigrés, Juliette refused to voluntarily exile herself and remained in Paris, although Madame de Staël begged her to go with her to Coppet. Ironically, this time Napoleon wrote to Madame de Staël asking her to return to Paris. She refused and didn't return until some time after he had been banished for good. But by the spring of 1817, Madame de Staël was dying, and by the side of her deathbed, Juliette was about to meet the most important person in her life. Although she was ill, Madame de Staël still received friends, and on the 28th of May there was a dinner party at her house, to which Juliette was invited. But Germaine was not well enough to attend, and instead her daughter received the guests. One of them was François René de Chateaubriand, who found himself sitting by Madame Récamier during this funeral banquet, but without exchanging a word with her. When, towards the end of dinner, Chateaubriand said, she timidly addressed a few words to me about Madame de Staël's illness, I turned my head slightly and saw my guardian angel standing on my right. Chateaubriand had seen Juliette briefly 12 years earlier at Madame de Staël's, when he had just emerged from obscurity and became an established writer by publishing Atala, René, and the Genius of Christianity. But, as he said, at that time he was still quite timid and didn't dare lift his eyes to a woman surrounded by adorers. Aged only 51, Madame de Staël died on the 14th of July 1817, and her passing left a huge void in Juliette's life. She was by now 40 years old, and it seemed that she longed for deep and durable affection. To one of her friends, Juliette said, "I have never been happy, and I don't think I will ever be." But Chateaubriand was a magician. He was able to express in words more sensations than anyone had done before him. He was 49 years old, had a beautiful head, and the fascination of his romantic genius was irresistible. Within a year, he was able to make Juliette open her heart to sentiments she hadn't known before. About this, she later said, "It would be impossible for a head to be more completely turned than mine was by Monsieur de Chateaubriand. I used to cry all day." It was rumoured that he received her still intact. For his part, Chateaubriand was a man of many love affairs, and was also married. But he had no real intimacy with Madame de Chateaubriand. He bitterly complained that his wife never read 2 lines of his work. Meanwhile, Juliette bought a house with her own money, where she established herself with her husband, her father, and her husband's niece. But when Récamier sustained fresh losses in his business, she was forced to sell the house to help him out. As she was now determined to reorganize her life, Juliette sought refuge in the Abbaye aux Bois, and given that men weren't allowed to reside in the convent, she no longer lived with her husband. But there were no restrictions to visit Juliette, so Récamier and her father shared a house in the same neighbourhood and went to dine with her whenever they wanted. Although this modest abode wasn't very spacious, it had a certain charm. Chateaubriand called it the little cell, and once described it by saying, "A dark corridor separated 2 small rooms." The bedroom was ornamented with a bookcase, a harp, a piano, a portrait of Madame de Staël, and a view of Coppet by moonlight. When, quite out of breath with having climbed 3 flights of stairs, I entered the cell just as twilight was falling, I was enchanted. The view from the windows was over the garden of the Abbaye, and among the green clumps of trees the nuns could be seen moving about and the schoolgirls playing. The top of an acacia came up as high as one could see. Pointed steeples stood out against the sky, and on the horizon were the heights of Sèvres. The dying sun touched the picture with gold and entered by the open windows. Madame Récamier was at her piano. The Angelus was ringing, and the sound of the bell, which seemed to be mourning for the day that was dying, Il giorno pianger che si muore, mingled with the last notes of the Invocation to Night from Romeo and Juliet by Steibelt. Here, day after day, Chateaubriand came precisely at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to see Juliette, and so remarkable was his punctuality that her neighbours set their watches by him as he passed. And so Chateaubriand became the centre of her world, and like no one else, Juliette seemed to understand this melancholy man whose life revolved around beauty, dreams, and greatness. In time, this little cell would become the most sought-after literary salon in Paris, where Juliette received literary men and women and politicians of every school and shade of opinion, such as Constant, Tocqueville, Chateaubriand, Guizot, Lamartine, Balzac, Sainte-Beuve, the Comtesse de Boigny, the Duchess of Abrantes, and many others. Few women were more extensively acquainted with current literature, and to her salon at the Abbaye aux Bois more than to her beauty, Madame Récamier owes her lasting celebrity. When Chateaubriand became Minister of Foreign Affairs, he met a lady who caught his fancy, and this made Juliette suffer. But it couldn't have been otherwise, because Chateaubriand was a heartbreaker who had scores of women sighing at his feet. So, judging that separation and time would decide the course of her relationship with Chateaubriand, Juliette went to Italy for about a year. And she was right. When she returned, Chateaubriand, who in the meantime had lost his post as minister, hastened to the Abbey at his usual hour, and not a word of reproach or explanation was exchanged between them. At the end of September 1832, when Juliette travelled to Geneva to join Chateaubriand, they decided to pay a visit to Coppet, to the grave of Madame de Staël, the woman who had brought them together. There, wandering along the avenues where Juliette had loved to stroll together with Madame de Staël, they talked about those aching and regretted days when passion is at once the bliss and torment of youth. And later Chateaubriand would say, "It seems to me that all that I have ever loved, I loved in Juliette, and that she was the hidden spring of all my tenderness. My memories of diverse ages, those of my dreams, as well as those of my realities, have become moulded, blended into a mixture of sweet charms and sufferings, of which she has become the visible embodiment." For many years Chateaubriand had been writing his memoirs, and in February 1834 Juliette suggested that she should invite a few of their closest friends to listen to the reading of some of the chapters from the Memoirs from Beyond the Grave. As he wanted to test how the posterity would receive his work, Chateaubriand agreed. It was a triumph, and all the newspapers begged the writer for some fragments. He kept on writing, and always read to Juliette alone in the first instance what he had written. Soon she had to use her imagination to make space in her salon for the growing audience who wanted to be present. Some years later, soon after his wife died, Chateaubriand begged Juliette, who had long been a widow, to honour his name by consenting to bear it. "Why should we marry?" she said to him. "At our age there can be no impropriety in my taking care of you. If we were younger, I shouldn't hesitate. Let us change nothing in so perfect an affection." As they approached the end of their lives, Victor Hugo went to see them and said, "Monsieur de Chateaubriand, at the beginning of 1847, was a paralytic, and Madame Récamier was blind." The woman who could no longer see stretched forth her hands gropingly towards the man who could no longer feel. Their hands met. God be praised. Life was dying, but love still lived. And then Juliette employed all her remaining courage and strength to soothe Chateaubriand's last hours. Whenever she went out of the room, overcome by grief, Chateaubriand, who had lost the power of speech for some days, followed her with his eyes, with the fear of not being able to see her again. He drew his last breath on the 4th of July, 1848, with his guardian angel by his side, who had devoted the last 30 years of her life to the man she loved the most. She died in May of the following year, when she became the victim of a cholera epidemic that was raging in Paris. Such roughly was the story of Juliette Récamier, a lady whom Chateaubriand had likened to a soft light illuminating a stormy scene.